Hi.
Hi. So today we are going to begin to progress to dealing with some of the common ways people are going to sort of react to this choke. Last week, of course, we laid out the tactical fight here, driving them backward, facilitating them to drive inward to get the guard, or just bullying them backward and taking top position with this guillotine. That's always a viable option. In fact, the more you present that option, the more they're going to have to react by driving in. We talked about the finish, kind of doing the golf swing, whether we're in a neutral place like a front headlock situation or the guard. And we talk about some transfer options from the guard to really make sure that we have that range of motion to secure this finish. So it's fair to sort of ask, well, okay, well then what are ways that they're going to deal with this? And really the first thing the thing I want to talk about today is, what if I get the choke grip, but it's not really in tight enough to finish them quickly? Right? Everything we've done thus far has pretty much been assuming that once I secure this head and arm control and I start putting the squeeze on the finish, I'm going to get the tap. But sometimes your angle's not quite right. Sometimes their chin gets in the way. Sometimes, it just isn't coordinated exactly in the way it needs to be to secure the finish. And in that space where you're trying to, finagle your wrists, as we talked about, you want to keep tight upper body, tight guard situation, but loose hands and wrists so you can make these adjustments, right? But as you're making these adjustments, they're actively trying to resist and defend, and there's two primary ways that that's going to manifest. Okay, ready to go? So the first way that that's likely to manifest is, can I get you on the bottom, please? Is defensive, right? And really, I don't want to say the first way. It's like they're both equal. It just depends on their personal preference, what they see here. But one way is more of a defensive response, which is they're attacking my neck, so I'm going to try to beat the thing that's attacking my neck, right? So she gets the guard, she gets the choke, and maybe I'm just not, it's not quite sinking, so they settle, it's good, hold on really tight. They settle back, and they're trying to crowbar their head out. So what happens is their base goes back quite often, so they get heavy back here, and then they try to slip this head free. And it's not to say, so I want you to really secure that really tight. It's not to say that it would work really quickly, but if she can't quite finish this on a long enough timeline, it's reasonable to say that someone might be able to get their head free. Now, I happen to be particularly well designed for getting my head free, because as you may notice, I have no head knot. I'm like a pencil eraser. I just fucking stab it, like un-guillotine. That's not exactly true. It's just, but either way, people with head knots might take a little longer to get free, but it's just to say, like, once they hunker back, if you're not getting the finish, if they're not actively getting choked, they're going to try to do that. Alternatively, if they can't beat the choke, then they might try to beat the position, right? So she gets the choke again. And so we're here, and if I can put my forehead on the ground, I might be working here, trying to compromise. And let's say I get this way down and cross over, and then I pass, right? So basically, what we're talking about here is one option being, they might try to beat the guillotine by attacking the choke itself and clearing their head, and they might try to beat the guillotine by clearing the guard configuration and getting their legs free. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what we want to, fortunately, the way that we're going to address both of these methods of defense and prevention and sort of defeating the choke is actually going to be, we're going to use one solution to solve two problems, which is, by the way, pretty much by and large the way you want to think about jiu-jitsu. If you need 7 solutions to solve 7 problems, your solutions suck. If you want one solution to solve 7 problems, right? Like, that's a much stronger ratio in your favor. So before I get into how we're actually going to apply the principles that we're talking about, I want to touch on something that's going to seem like a non sequitur, but it's going to be very relevant. And I think it's important to touch on this point, okay? For the sake of argument, if I were to say, how does a front roll work? Okay? I think a fair way to look at it is, if we had to break it down mechanically, there are 3 main components to a front roll. Okay? Number 1 is my head has to sort of veer towards almost like looking under one of my armpits, right? So if I were posted here, I would look under one of my armpits, right? And that exposes this opening. I would take the opposite shoulder and put it lower than the shoulder of the armpit, right? And then last, I have to elevate my hips, in the sense of if I try to keep my hips and my shoulders parallel, that's what happens, right? There's no front roll. I have to elevate my hips enough to create the clearance for that front roll. Does that make sense, guys? Why is this relevant? Because, what do we say? One, I have to make them look into their armpit. Two, is I have to take the shoulder, in essence, that they're looking away from and put it lower than the shoulder they're looking toward. And three, is I have to elevate their hips higher than their shoulders. So why this is important is because, actually, let me grab a mic for this. Let me get you that arm and guillotine spot. Is because once I get this configured, and I'll get into the mechanics of how we get here in a second, but if I can just find a way to get this foot, so the foot that was over the back in the fight, right, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. Let me just walk this in so you don't roll your wrist. Well, look, guys, I can turn his head to look inside the armpit. I can elevate the shoulder of the armpit, which means that the shoulder he's looking away from gets lower, and then what does my elevator hook do? Just lift his hips. There's my front roll. So the beauty and kind of the elegance of this is that once I have this arm and guillotine configuration, I have a really powerful mechanism for forcing this front roll to happen. Does that make sense, guys? And it's going to be very relevant when we go into Wednesday's lesson, but the thing to keep in mind is like this head and arm control is really strong at pushing the head in and pushing the shoulders up. So if I grab you just kind of here, it's like my ability to, and there's going to be a little pressure on your neck, so just prepare for that, is my ability to just kind of like bully him here. You guys see this? I mean, obviously Mike's not giving me a ton of resistance, but my ability to just kind of wedge my hand against his sternum and take his head and push it down. It's hard to see a lot of times with the guillotines what the hands are doing. You can ask Mike, there's a lot of pressure pushing up on the chest as my elbow puts a lot of pressure and pushes his head through. So this is one of the most important facets of the arm and guillotine fight, because this is what allows me to start turning this from just purely like, hey, here's a cool attack if they double leg me or I pull guard, to here's a system I can apply where, okay, if I end up underneath, I'm going to take him over and get on top. And likewise, if we can kind of, we'll get into that more later, more to Wednesday, but like how I can toggle that to keep this wheel going. But let's talk about mechanically how I'm going to accomplish this. So let's turn this way. And you want to stay right there. Thank you. So we started out, I had the arm and guillotine, I'm on this shoulder or whatever, and I'm here, and it's not quite sinking, right? So the thing I need to do is get this foot on the inside, right? Especially if Mike is like actively taking his right arm to pull his head free or something. He's signaling his hips back, and that's what we're going to address first. What if he hunkers his hips back? So the first thing I want to note here, guys, and I would argue maybe in some ways the most important on a long term, is that what I do not do is keep my hips on this line and try to puncture this foot in here. Now this is a thing, I'm flexible, I have gummy hips, and I can get my foot in here quite fine. But something to keep in mind, guys, is that what direction do I need to take Mike's hips? Like, relative to my positioning. That way, right? To the left. I'm taking that basically towards Kyle. What direction is my knee facing? Right? It's facing, and it's actually, in fact, facing not just up, but it's facing away. So the kick I'm going to generate from this is the opposite direction, which means that all I'm using to elevate him is not structure, it's muscle, right? It's muscle pushing in. This is a really bad position of your knee. Let me pull you out of here in just a moment. This is not good. Anytime your foot starts getting closer to you than your knee, you're putting stress on that joint. And it might not, you're not going to blow your knee out likely with one elevator speed, but I'm telling you, if you do this for years and you keep stressing your knee like this, your knees are going to feel it eventually. And you're not going to have knees that are super strong anymore. And I can speak from experience, being a dude who can do this quite easily and used to use his knees a lot like this. So protect your knees. Use them in ways that make sense. So what I want instead, I'll grab you here, is I want to scoot my hips away. So he's trying to pull his head up and stay crunched. I scoot my hips out so that instead of having to puncture my knee with my foot with my knee wide, I keep everything in a straight line. And now, what direction is my knee facing? Right, to the left. From here, all I have to do is kick that leg like I'm the Rockettes over my shoulder. Okay? Boom. Very simple. Right? If can I get you to put your, I'm going to settle that, and I'm going to get my knee wide and my foot in, and I want you to settle your hips real heavy, and tell me how, and we'll see if I can sweep you. Hey, what's up, boss? So we're here. I have the foot in across the belly, and I'm here, I get this, I drop this down to get this in. It's really hard, but watch what happens, guys. We go back. I'm here, I fell to this side, I scoop my hips free, I drop the shield leg, and I go here. Now you're showing the hips, right? A lot of power in that line, because instead of trying to like kick them that way, like this, I'm here. It's a straight line. I'm using my hands to leverage his shoulders over, and I'm kicking in that straight line. Now, the reason why I start with them hunkering their hips down first is because if I get you back, let's say, right here, and okay, I pull this guard, and he starts getting up on his toes to pass, well, he's already there, right? Like, I don't have to do much work. But the big key detail in that is, the visible opponent, is that as long as I'm here, I won't have power. So my hips go out so that I can go here. And then I kick him everything in that line. It's not like an elevator sweep like you would with a butterfly where I'm like this so much. It's just straight up hands and feet in that same line, kicking them over. Also, I'll make one more note. And if you weren't here on Wednesday, don't worry too much about this, but if, make you one more time, you end up in the half guard configuration, this is actually even pretty powerful here too. Because the thing about this half guard is as long as I stay tight on this figure four, like get your knee free, right, keep going. He has to get real close. So he has to elevate his hips so high up that this sweep is really strong. In fact, I would say from the half guard, the strongest of the three. So, figure out you out of that. So Mike can see all that. So let's do this angle this time, right here. So let me do. So option one, again, I go for my finish. I'm falling to my side. She's hunkering back, trying to pull her head free. Remember, I got to crunch my chest up, so keep trying to pull your head out, right? And you might even, use that right hand like you were just doing a crowbar, right? So I have to stay pinched. I scoop my hips out. My inside foot drops, my outside foot comes in, and I want my knee facing this line. From here, ready for the flip. I'm going to push my hands up into the sternum and kick my feet over. Likewise, if they try to pass, I'm here, and they're hopping up, I get past here. Same idea, kick them over. And finally, if I have that half guard, so I have a tight figure four on the opposite side of the choke, and they start hopping to get that knee clear. They have to elevate themselves so high that the elevator sweep is really, quite effortless. Now you may notice that I didn't work on climbing on top. That's what we're going to work on next, but I didn't want to get that down. Does anybody have any questions about that? Does that not make sense to anybody? Anybody? Anything? No? Delightful. Let's start working out. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.